Number 3. Frisco number 1522.
1926 Mountain Type was one of the 30 T-54 482 locomotives delivered to the Frisco Railroad. The 1522 had 69-inch driving wheels and has a tractive force of 56,380 pounds. For a dual-purpose locomotive, you would want your driving wheels to be a little small so the engine would have good grip on the rails. 1522 and 16 other T-54s were upgraded in the beginning of World War II to have 210 psi boilers, 65,550 pounds of tractive effort, 69.5-inch driving wheels, and have a booster engine on the trailing truck. A booster engine is a small steam engine that powers the trailing wheels to help start the engine, pull its train easier when standing still. 1522 would stay in service until 1951 when it was retired. In 1959, 1522 was donated to the National Museum of Transportation in St. Louis, Missouri. 1522 would stay until 1985 when the St. Louis Steam Train Association selected the engine for restoration. Three years later, the 1522 steamed again in April of 1988 and began pulling excursions. Some popular trips this engine took were in 1990, 1994, and 2001. In 1990, the 1522 participated at the National Railway Historical Society Convention. The 1994 excursion was the 1522 double heading with NW 611 to Atlanta, Georgia, and in 2001, the 1522 pulled a BNSF Employee Appreciation Special Train in Texas on Frisco trackage. When 1522 pulled excursions, the engine would be considered the loudest steam locomotive in the world because of the engine's stack torque. Sadly, rising insurance costs for the SLSTA would be forced to retire the engine at the end of 2002. Today, in 1522, is on static display at the museum in St. Louis. For now, there are no plans for refurbishing 1522 for operational purposes.
Number 2, Norfolk and Western number 1218. Yep, that's right. The one loco that has gone number 1 on other people's lists is only number 2 on my list. Even though this is considered probably the most famous retired steam excursion star in the country, you just couldn't top my number 1 pick, which I'll go into that later. The 2664 wheel arrangement was a pretty rare one to begin with only 60 such locomotives being built in total in North America. The Norfolk and Western Railroad had the biggest amount of that wheel arrangement. The A-class locomotives were designed to pull high-speed heavy freight trains up to 70 miles per hour, and they also were seen pulling some passenger trains from time to time. The 1218 was made in June of 1943 and was retired in 1959. Even though another Class A locomotive, number 1240, pulled some farewell to steam excursions, it was sadly scrapped in 1960. After the 1240 was scrapped, the 1218 was known to be the final steam locomotive left in the world with a 2664 wheel arrangement. After 1218 was retired, it was used as a steam generator for an industrial plant. Then, in 1965, F. Nelson Blount bought that locomotive from the plant for a Steamtown USA collection. 3 years later, the owner of the Norfolk and Western Railroad decided to cosmetically restore the 1218. In 1971, when her restoration was completed, she was donated to the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke. 14 years later, 1218 was given to the Norfolk Southern for restoration in exchange for 2 diesels. In 1987, 1218 made her break-in runs and started to pull excursions. Some noteworthy trips the 1218 took was in 1989 when she was in a triple header with Norfolk and Western number 611 and Nickel Plate Road Light Mikado number 587. Then, in 1990, she went to that year's National Railway Historical Society Convention, along with Frisco 1522, mentioned earlier, and 819, and Union Pacific number 844. Finally, in 1991, the 1218 performed a triple header with Norfolk and Western number 611 and Southern Railway Mikado number 4501. Sadly, 1991 would be the last year the 1218 would run. After her last run, she went to the Irondale shops in Alabama for restoration. in hopes of getting her ready for the 1996 steam season. We all know that this wasn't the case. After the deaths of William Claytor and his younger brother Robert, the two men were responsible for the Norfolk Southern and the 1218's return. Major restrictions were placed on the steam trains, limiting where they can run and when they can go. Also, yearly insurance costs built up from $10 million to $25 million, with another increasement in the next year. And finally, the yard switching accident in the yard caused to derail and damage of 9 steam program passenger cars, with 2 of them deemed unrepairable. In December 1994, the Norfolk Southern had to close their steam program with the final run of Norfolk and Western number 611. In 1996, the 1218 was put back together and hauled to the East End shops in Roanoke for storage. In 2001, the 1218 was donated to the city of Roanoke, reunited with the 611, and now resides on permanent display. From what I heard, the 1218 has a lot of parts missing when it was reassembled. So, as long as someone has the money and the know-how to get the job done, 1218 could have a slight chance of a second Excursion career. Now, before we get on to number 1, here are some honorable mentions for this list. Here is my number 1 pick. All of the surviving Reading T1 Northerns. You should have seen these engines a long time ago from this list, but here they are now. Before we talk about our 4 engines, I do want to mention something. Some people know this, some don't. I'll just say for people who don't know. At first glance, you may think that the Reading T1s were directly built as 484 Northerns. Instead, they were heavy rebuilds from 280 consolidations. The Reading Railroad was best known for their anthracite coal, which was a slow-burning coal. It was the most efficient in the world, as a matter of fact. But not only it was a common carrier of anthracite coal, their steam locomotives also burned it. Sadly, during World War II, the 280s were very worn out. In fact, they needed some major overhauls fast, because during the war, no engine could be spared for an overhaul or even heavy repairs. And the Reading Railroad needed more horsepower, but at the same time they didn't have enough money to afford the horsepower. So what they did is they took 30 of their old 280 engines and supersized them into gigantic 484 Northerns, giving us the legendary T1s we all know and love today. In total, 30 of them were built between 1945 and 1947, and they were numbered 2100 to 2129. Reading T1s were into 2 batches. There was engines numbered 2100 to 2119 were used for freight service, while numbers 2120 to 2129 were used for freight and passenger trains because the last 10 engines had roller bearings. T1s had a short-lived career. They all were out of service in 1954. However, a traffic surge on the Reading Road in 1955 brought some back to service. However, in June of 1956, the Reading leased some of their T1s to the Pennsylvania Railroad, and those being T1s numbers 2107, 2111, 2112, 2113, 2114, 2115, 2119, and 2128. Eventually, in 1957, the T1s on the Pennsylvania Railroad were scrapped, except for number 2128. The Reading Road kept a small amount of their T1s, engines like 2100, 2101, 2102, 2123, and 2124. The Reading Railroad kept these engines and used them on publicity and excursion runs known as the Reading Rambles or the Iron Horse Rambles. Now, 2101 was used as a standby engine and never ran. 2123 was used as a parts engine, while the other three T1s, engines numbers 2100, 2124, and 2102 were used for the Rambles. Now, also in between there, Reading 2123 was retired in 1966 and was scrapped, which is why she doesn't exist today.
2124 was the first locomotive used on the Reading Rambles in October of 1959. 2124 would run for the Rambles until 1963 when her flue time expired. She was retired and was sold to Steamtown National Historic Site in New Hampshire, later located in Vermont. The whole collection would stay there until 1983-84 when the collection was moved to Scranton, PA. The 2124 still resides there today, cosmetically restored in the Rambles paint scheme.
Next is Reading 2101, which is the most famous Ramble. After the Rambles, she, along with her sister 2100, was sold to a scrapyard in Baltimore, Maryland. The two T1s would stay there until 1975, when they were acquired by Ross Rowland for the American Freedom Train. Since 2101 was in better condition than 2100, 2101, which took 30 days to restore, became American Freedom Train number 1. After the Freedom Train, 2101 got its original number back and was painted in Chessie System colors. The 2101 was reassigned to pull the famous Chessie Steam Special for the 150th anniversary of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. For 2 years, 2101 will pull the Chessie Steam Special until 1979, when she was badly damaged in a roundhouse fire in Russell, Kentucky. After that, 2101 was sent to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum in Baltimore. Today, the locomotive is in its American Freedom Train colors, but the tender is actually from 2100. Now on to 2102. 2102 was first used in the Rambles in 1962, along with its sisters 2100 and 2124. 2102 would run the Rambles until 1964, when she was sold to Steam Tours in Akron, Ohio. The 2102 also masqueraded as the now extinct D&H Northerns in the year of 1973. The 2102 was renumbered and re-leathered to D&H number 302. A year later, another Ohio tourist group acquired the 2102 and overhauled her. In 1977, the 2102 would steam again and pull some excursions, and even do a double header with Grand Trunk Western Mikado number 4070 at the Horseshoe Curve. Unfortunately, the 4070 had broken an eccentric rod, and Conrail had banned steam operations for a few years. After that, the 2102 was overhauled again for the tourist group. In the beginning of 1985, 2102 met up at the Reading shops for the 40th anniversary of the Reading T1 class. Afterwards, the engine was sold to the Blue Mountain and Reading Railroad in Port Clinton, Pennsylvania. The engine quickly became a running mate to Reading and Northern number 425, which was restored 2 years earlier. 2102 would perform many excursions on the BMMR and even haul some coal trains during her career. 2102 run on other trackage besides the Blue Mountain and Reading. 2102 would also run for Conrail, Gettysburg, and the High Iron Company. Between December of 1986 through 1987, 2102's tender would be repainted into the We the People scheme to represent the 200th year of signing the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, in August of 1991, the engine would take its last run while pulling the Anti-Site Express. In September of 1995, the engine was moved to Steamtown to try to restore it. Later in '98, the engine was taken apart and began restoration. In the same year, 2102 was reassembled and brought back to the Blue Mountain in Reading. Today, the 2102 is being restored by the Blue Mountain in Reading, and recently the engine had a test fire. Later this year, The engine will be pulling Excursions when her restoration is complete.
The prototype engine, number 2100, so many people say it may have the strangest story of all the preserved T1s, mainly because 2100 probably spent more time out of service than pulling Excursions. After being used as a parts engine, number 2100 would stay in storage until 1988. Short time, in between a year or two, she was owned by Richard Kuhn, the owner of Lionel Trains. In fact, Richard Kuhn was so enthralled by his engine that he decided to make a model of it in 1989, and it was the 6th locomotive to have rail sounds in it. Unfortunately for Kuhn, his ownership of the locomotive wouldn't last for too long. Over the years, 2100 would go through several owners and be purchased by a man in 1995 by the name of Thomas Paine. He converted 2100 to burn oil, which was not a good thing since the boiler pressure in the locomotive kept on dropping and it actually weakened the engine's performance. Thomas Paine was going to use 2100 up in the Rockies in Canada for some few excursions. Thankfully, those plans never came to fruition. 2007, 2100 was moved to Tacoma, Washington. For only a year, the 2100 pulled some excursions on the short-lived Golden Pacific Railroad in Tacoma, Washington. After 2008, the 2100 was put into dead storage once again. But fortunately, in 2015, a new group called Fire Up the 2100 bought the engine and they were going to use it for excursions. They converted the locomotive back to anthracite coal, and they're hoping to get the 2100 done in 2021, which is actually this year right now. Because of the history of these relatively known 484 Northerns, and them pulling the most famous excursions during the steam era, made the Reading T1s on my number 1 pick of my top 12 retired steam excursion stars from the USA. Well, that does it for my top 12 list. If you want to see more lists of top 15 or 20 or any other list besides steam trains, feel free to tell me in the comment section below. And if you would like to help me voice in a couple of recordings, feel free to ask me. Thank you for watching this documentary, and don't forget to subscribe. I have more lists coming in the near future. This is Brendan Trainz, signing off.